let's be honest, with the amount of time we have between the last game and the last round and the first game of the next round, if I can't get this video out in time, all hope is lost for me. So here I am doing kind of the wrap up, but this is going to be a unique one. It's a wrap up technically of the conference finals. We still have the finals to go, but spoiler alert, our pool's pretty much done. That's it, folks. So I'll get to that later. Going to follow the same format. I'll talk about the fallen teams. I do want to do a previews matchup. Let's be honest, I'll still probably do a final video just to wrap up the season, but then I'll get to the pool stuff. So here we go. Not surprisingly, with the only two teams left, I'm going to jump right into the one that I think looks the best going into next year. I think you could make the argument that both Indy and Minnesota overachieved if you looked at their expectations from the start of the season. But obviously, as the season goes on, Minnesota kind of showed that they're not a flash in the pan and that they're a bit more legit. So I think they're the team that obviously has a lot more coming into next season. You could make the argument that since they achieved so highly, that maybe next year is down for a letdown and the West is certainly harder. But overall, you've got Ant-Man who made a leap this year and probably could make another one in the next year or two in terms of talent gap. You've got a really well-constructed lineup with a few tweaks that could happen. Now, Cat should be an interesting one. I mentioned in last week's 2 cents the benefits of having a more open draft where nobody really knows where the star quality is going to come from if your GM's solid later on in the rounds. But I think one of the downsides is having a first round pick or going very early. Kat can probably testify to this. It puts like undue pressure on that player. So whenever they have a bad series like he had against Dallas, even though he had a decent one against Denver, people always go and look back to his draft status and say, really, was he worth it? But I think Gobert is probably the more interesting one here. I don't think they make a move with him, but the roster design around him, I think we saw some of the issues that they had. Now, if you just looked at the highlights, you might think this was a blowout series. I actually think they could have and should have in Minnesota won games 2 and 3. I think you got the play call or the out of bounds call that turned out it was Kyrie's foul, but for whatever reason they can't, they can't change the foul call even when they see it on instant replay. You've got that poor coaching decision, and apparently it was the coaching decision to allow the switch so Luka got Gobert on the perimeter. He's not a phenomenal perimeter defender at all times, especially against someone like Luka. I mean, who is really great against Luka, but you can be better. You saw the face of his teammates on the switch. You saw Luka's reaction, and this puts Gobert in a really weird category of someone who gets crapped on like unnecessarily, again, like I said last week, by Draymond, who doesn't seem to know the difference between being mean and critical. But even Luka seemed to kind of have this animosity against him, and Gobert does seem to be a divisive player. But kind of like in our pool, it's funny, I can make an argument for this for a Celtic later on. Obviously, we're awards based, but we do that out of like laziness, just because we don't want to like have constant tweaks to lineups in a fantasy situation. But awards are a funky one, and now he's won the Defensive Player of the Year a couple of times, and he puts him in a rare category of someone who can do that. But I mean, if you look at some of the best players, I mean, Jokic went after him. Luka obviously was starving to go after him. It's a little different because positionally that's there, and I mean, like, already you don't see people really wanting to take on Wemby. And so you've got who would be the better presence versus who was the better stats guy in awards, and the team did better. So there is a funky argument there that I think Gobert just falls victim to in a similar way that Kat probably doesn't deserve. Well, he might deserve the Bambi references, but maybe he doesn't deserve the draft capital idea. Gobert signed a huge contract. He's won these awards, but he just constantly seems to disappoint in these larger than life moments. That's going to hurt. So Minnesota ready to go, but they could make some moves and be exciting and actually not lose what makes them great, mainly their perimeter, Ant-Man, etc. So I have them slightly ahead of Indiana in terms of which team I think is better suited for next year. Speaking of Indiana, I don't think it's a huge surprise they're second here. They're on the other end of that bubble where they massively overachieved. Think like Celtics a couple of years ago when they made it pretty far when they were still young, and that kind of the expectation kind of burnt them for a couple of years. Or even Atlanta a couple of years ago when they made a run in the playoffs and then they expected it for the following years, and obviously that hasn't happened. I don't think Indy falls as far down, but I think it's a little bit of because they just seem to have a good gelling situation. They are probably missing a piece. I think some more consistency on their defense is something, and maybe even another scorer if they can. I know they have tons of scoring, but that's out of their actual offensive structure. But long story short, they still have a lot of youth in their skill set positions. They have people who should not be dropping off next year, but actually getting a bit better. So will they be able to compete with the Bucks when they're healthy, the 76ers when they're healthy, the Knicks next year when they come back, obviously the Celtics? I still wouldn't put them in the top 4 in the East next year, but I have them as a playoff team, and as they've shown, they can show some grittiness when it counts. So I have them clearly below Minnesota, but they're still looking fine coming into next year, so I don't think they necessarily need to blow things up. On to our finals matchup. We've got one series left. Will it be better? It's funny, that last round and a bit, I mean, I really, really loved Denver and Minnesota. I like the Knicks and Philly. There was a few kind of half series in there that I really, really enjoyed. I guess you could probably say, the Phoenix in round 1, how that when they went down again to Minnesota, and some of the first round series were good enough. I think we could probably see a better one here, but it really depends. I mentioned before the awards bit and sometimes the expectation. You're getting a lot of messages now, the Tatum versus Brown and who gets awards and who does this. I actually think the awards are like the worst parts of the Celtics. I think Tatum is a great example. A couple years ago when you had to pick one center, now you can have multiple, but we still have Embiid getting injured. You had Embiid and Jokic who seemed to be going head to head for MVP, so only one of them could make first team. And by default, someone like Tatum has slipped in and actually has a couple of first-team All-NBAs when most people, myself included, probably don't have him as a top 5 player. But I definitely have him as second team, and I definitely think he's a 6 through 10 player and probably one of the best in that tier. But because he gets constantly put into, well, he's got this many first-team All-NBAs, is he as good as Luka? Is he as good as Giannis? Well, I don't think he is, but he's that next tier down. Brown on that other end is kind of unspoken, but now it's so spoken because it's Boston, and Boston loves to complain how no one pays attention to them, but everyone kind of pays attention to them. So their tandem, I know people are picking it apart. As far as I know, it's all crap and it's all kind of media hype that they get along fine. When it comes down to it, I think I know what to expect with them. Obviously, I have massively underestimated Dallas. I think I've had them down on almost every series, and I've been wrong. I've actually been right more often than I'm wrong on these series, which is not amazing because it's been fairly chalky. But I don't know if I've called Dallas right in one regard. I think I'm just underestimating Luka, and I think we forget that Luka's won at every level. I mean, he won La Liga when he was, 15, 16. He got a Euro League when he was 18 and was actually the scoring leader. By the way, 21.1 points. I looked that up when he was the scoring leader in the Euro League, and we talk about how Euro is all offense and no defense, and yet look at the difference. And the game style is different and the game length. I'm just saying, just think about it. But maybe we're underestimating just Luka's impact and obviously Kyrie doing a great job, the defense kind of solidifying behind them and the role players really stepping up. Could this be like Luka's breakout year where he has an awesome finals, then he goes to the Olympics and Slovenia can maybe make a run? Maybe, but to me, it actually comes down to KP. If Porzingis is healthy, I think there's just too much offensively for Dallas to deal with, and I think the Celtics could wrap it up. And I think they could do it in 5, but I don't think they would. I think they do it to 6 because if you watch the Celtics, they actually aren't great with a lead. Their offense gets super stagnant. Tatum just kind of dribbles around for a while and then shoots a bad shot. And I think Dallas is phenomenal when they're just slightly behind, and that's when Kyrie and Luka can go on their runs. So I would say Celtics in 6 if KP plays. If he doesn't play, I do see it going to 7, and any game 7 is a toss-up. I can't lie, though, as much as I really go through it, and I know some of you on this pod love the Celtics and some of you hate the Celtics, I think when I watch this, and I am going to watch it, it wouldn't surprise me if I'm cheering for Dallas, I'll be honest with you. But like I've said, that could be the kiss of death, so what do I know? I said it before, but the pool's effectively over, even though I haven't put the points in because I don't like jinxing people. But let's take a look at the players first, then I'll get to what I'm talking about. I mentioned this last time, and actually by the time the video came out, most of these awards were out, but I wanted to wait. So So effectively, we got our NBA defensive and NBA all first and second and third teams. So in the defensive team, remember you get 2 points for second team, 3 points for first. On the first team, Herb Jones was actually not taken, and only Drew Holiday was taken from the second team. So there were a lot of points there. Just remember that next year when we have our ad drop, because if you're like me, I took someone to try and get the sixth man. Maybe I should have taken a defensive player, and I would have got a few extra points. Actually, someone like Caruso probably works out to be the most coveted non-taken player because he did double down, whereas even someone like Naz Reid obviously got sixth man, but Caruso with the Hustle Award and with second team, that could have been helpful for people. In terms of the first, second, and third team, so that's 2 points for third, then 3, then 4. So obviously first team, those 5 players get well respected and rewarded. Everybody was taken here. We didn't have, not surprisingly, Brunson was obviously the biggest pickup. And that again goes to Rennie, so that's a big pickup there. Unfortunately, Shea Harden didn't pay out for you, Malik Monk didn't pay out for me, and nobody didn't pay out for Horst. So we could have kind of benefited, but it does make Tyrese Maxey. Congratulations, Shaner. That was the best pickup of the year with the 5 points. I think if we take a look, no massive surprises. We got our MVP at number 1. I will say Luka was available. I mean, I took Giannis first and 6 points, and that was obviously not the pick you want to make. Luka and Wemby got 9 points, so I got some steals here in the second and third round. Unfortunately, I forgot that you can actually get points on the second half, whereas pretty much everybody else actually got, and if you look at Rennie, probably the difference maker in his was his late round picks, getting Sabonis, Kawhi, and then the Brunson steal at the end, because he did have some disappointment in the middle. Chainer, I fear to think what could have been if Embiid was still around. Would he have gotten a first team? I mean, when he left, he was getting MVP hype, he was getting first team hype, so who knows? But ultimately, Shea, sorry, buddy, you kind of took the brunt on this one. You didn't really have anybody go off. I mean, Booker didn't have the great years. Ant-Man, if we were giving points on transcendence, because a lot of people think he made that step, unfortunately, it didn't really appear to get him too many points or win too many months or anything like that. And obviously, Curry just got banged up because, Thompson was playing horrible all year and Green kept missing games, and so he was kind of on his own. So a down year for him there. I did just barely squeak out a win over Rennie on the player side, but now we get to team, so we know that I was the only one still kicking who could have gotten points. Now, who knew that Indiana would be one of the steals because they went so far in the championship or the midseason tournament. I did kind of dominate the midseason tournament. And if you look at this, you're like, oh, well, Fisher, you won player, you won team. You forget there's 2 teams here in the white. And what that means is they're not color coded, and it's the big ones. So you've got a making the NBA finals is 8 points. NBA champion is 10. So while we still need to have the debate about the split category thing, and I'm right now on the high end of that, we know it doesn't really matter because Rennie's getting 10, he's getting 8. Even if a catastrophic events, I am not jinxing anything, and they have to cancel the NBA finals, which they would never do, the teams would still have made the NBA finals, and that's more than enough because if we go to our overall points, I've got a 5-point lead, and he's going to get 18 points. So my math teacher tells me Rennie's going to win by 13. So I think in the final standings, unfortunately, Shea, you kind of fell a little bit low. Your teams did okay. Your players just definitely did not. Chainer, you had the exact opposite. You needed your teams to step up, and they really did not help you out, whereas your players were holding strong. Horst, you're in a similar boat, so you're going to finish third, it looks like, where you still did fine on the players. Your teams did okay, but in the end just kind of let you down. You really needed to push a little bit there. If you get 1 or 2 teams that make that run to the finals, I think you're in the mix. And then for me, I just had to, not make some of the horrible picks I made early. Rennie, you made some phenomenal picks. I think you stole a lot, especially when it comes to some of the team picks. I mean, if we go back and we look at, Minnesota late, Magic going that late, well done there. And we already talked about your players. So having a strong first 2, but then your last kind of picks here, making up the void. So once again, third pick overall was Rennie. This is the 3rd year in a row that third pick takes it. Just saying, might be competitive for next year. But congrats, Rennie. And as luck would have it, only a few days from now, I'll actually see you in person so I can present you with the winnings. Congrats, buddy. Full disclosure, this is actually take 2 because the first one went on way ramblier than I really wanted it to. And then by the end, I'm like, I can't put all this in. But what's funny is last week I did kind of ramble my way into my point. And this week I kind of had the same idea because I don't really feel like I've really earned anything to make the final point I'm trying to make. But I had a rough week in terms of rough series, let's say, in terms of kind of the sports media bit. I've already mentioned some of my problems with the TV coverage and how sometimes it can be trying to catch up with the negativity of like the TikTok, Twitter kind of crowd that is looking for a different kind of audience. But, you know, that to be said, with the NBA kind of having crap series and then stopping early and having a little bit of a break, and then the WNBA having a ton of games, it's been really interesting to see some of the conversation and the good parts of it. Something like I actually enjoyed the Stephen A. Smith bit with Monica McNutt, where she essentially kind of called him out, although she did try and do it respectfully. I know online we like to make it seem like it was a big battle, but if you actually watch it, he was kind of patting himself on the back for saying, well, we talk about it here on this show, women's sports, as much as possible. And she just kind of reminded him that, you know, later on you find out, like, she's been covering the sport for a few years now, I think about 4, if you didn't know. And she's been telling ESPN all this time that you really should be investing in the sport and WNBA a little bit more. But she just did remind him, like, hey, you know, you essentially run this league or this network. You could have talked about it a couple years ago and you didn't. You waited till this year. Now they've both made their separate statements because obviously he has a lot of power. So she wants to keep her job. She did stand by it though and say, you know, for whatever reason, we talk about it now and we didn't before. But see, I don't mind, even like it's making me think I really probably should subscribe to things like The Athletic. I don't mind when people who cover sports and actually put the effort in to looking for this. So even when like the First Take isn't my thing, just because I find it a bit yelly, but I like when people make sports bigger than it is, and I like that people cover it to that extent and can make cultural connections. But I don't need just everyone having just opinions as opposed to coverage. And just because you think you've seen it before, it just kind of brings it down. And then that negative spiral. I think we saw this. I mean, last year, I kind of had to stop following the MVP debate, the Jokic and Embiid thing. Now, the basketball side of it I liked, but then it does turn into a bit of a, well, you said this gotcha online bit, and people trying to catch people into making a point. You know, you see it a lot right now with Caitlin Clark. You can't feel too bad for her because obviously she's going to come out in the end on the positive on this one, and she's getting a lot of endorsements because of it. But the WNBA throwing her into so many games at the beginning, her getting roughed up a little bit. Now, rookie not being treated with open arms from vets, this is not a new story. You know, I remember LeBron having a slightly bigger frame and hearing when he was in high school that that's going to suit him well because they're going to knock him around a little bit because that's what you do to rookies. Some of the non-basketball related stuff like her getting thrown down, but the league has to step up. They make some rulings and it all sorts itself out. But people making it so if you like Caitlin Clark, then you obviously also have to mean this, or if you hate Caitlin Clark, then it obviously means this. It just gets a little bit tiring, and I think it's funny when we think about newer sports. So, you know, the Olympics are coming up, and if you're like me, you watch a little bit of them, you watch 2 hours of luge, and all of a sudden they have someone on there that tells you that pointing their toes makes them phenomenal. So you start to be like, oh, okay, I think I can recognize it, and you become kind of the expert, but only because you're listening to people who know it. I remember as well when UFC was quite young, they brought in Joe Rogan as a commentator, and not only was he, I mean, he was a successful enough comedian, but most people just knew him as the Fear Factor idiot, not the podcaster he's come on to be. But he was helpful if you watched it because he explained that it wasn't just a couple of guys lying on top of each other. They were looking to pass the guard, or when they grabbed the wrist, they're actually trying to set up, you know, Kimura, whatever. And it was helpful because you didn't know anything about the sport. I think the problem with women's basketball, and there's other problems as well. You see, even I feel like I have to tread light with my language because obviously there's a lot of other knock-on effects. But one referring to what I talk about, or what I'm talking about, because basketball, women's and men's basketball is similar. There's a few subtle differences, but the game itself is the same. And we've watched a lot of basketball, so I think people just assume they can chime in and give everything and be experts on the WNBA just because they watched a little bit of college basketball this year and they've decided who their new favorite team is. But we really probably should be deferring to the people who've covered it for a few years. And if you don't know some of the narratives, I mean, even into last year, there's kind of an interesting kind of New York, Vegas, one wins the you know, the Commissioner's Cup, and then the other wins the actual championship, and coming to this year, and then Connecticut and having a great year. There's a lot of additional storylines that it doesn't take you knowing 20 years of history to really appreciate, or you can just follow, you know, Diana Taurasi, who's been around for like 20 years. So you can kind of follow her ups and downs and when she's winning and when she's battling kind of through her career. But when it gets into the name calling stuff and it gets into the extensions, I'm just not having much fun anymore. And I think it was really tough. What's ironic about this, because the saddest of all of this is the story that brought me back into the positive. And the one I'll finish with, is the passing of Bill Walton. Obviously, this is insanely sad, and I just think he's a super interesting character because if you were alive and watching basketball in the 70s, you can probably tell stories about his time, under Wooden, UCLA, and the 2 national championships and the 3 Naismith Awards for Player of the Year. You probably then followed him to Portland, where he was phenomenal. Where in '77 he won the Finals MVP because they won the Finals the following year. He wins the league MVP, but then the following year he has to take it off and his body starts to break down. If you're alive more in the '80s, maybe you remember when the Celtics in '86 won their championship. He won 6th Man of the Year, so he had the humility of former MVP to come off the bench because he could only play about 18 minutes a game, but he played more games that season than at any other point like the last decade because he was load managed before load management was called it. But a lot of people, I think more on my age group, remember him as the color commentator who used to yell, "Throw it down, big man," to Shaq every time he touched the ball, and we used to get a laugh out of it. But he was so colorful, so dynamic, always brought joy to the game. And what's crazy is I think a lot of people do know he had a stutter for a majority of his young life. So he actually still credits the fact that he could commentate on live TV as one of his biggest accomplishments. But the reason why it kind of brought me back in the positive way, and again, cannot stress this enough, a death is not a positive, but for someone who always spoke so positively and was always upbeat, even his recent 30 for 30 is called Luckiest Man in the World. This is a guy who had a pretty negative diagnosis and knew that this death was likely coming for a while now, suffering through it, still doing podcasts, still doing TV appearances where he is insanely positive. He's also a guy who could have been one of the greats. I mean, he is considered by many one of the greats. I mean, a lot of people put him on the short list of like Robert Parrish and Arvydas Sabonis as some of the best passing big men of all time, but his body broke down. I mean, he could have had another 10 years or 5 or 6 in between where he was dominant in the league and maybe won another championship where he was another MVP, but his body just couldn't do it. And I think a lot of people would be bitter and jaded. And I mean, if you look at even people online have a lot of stuff going well for them. They're just bored and cranky, so they post negative shit. Whereas this guy's staying positive, and it was such to listen to some of his old interviews and to actually hear one of his more recent podcasts on something that I've listened to before on One Shining Podcast. Now, he does go very Grateful Dead-y, and he's out in left field sometimes, making just some bold claims, but always brings the positivity to the game and always has the perspective that basketball is a game that should be enjoyed. I'm going to steal one of his quotes that flow plus meaning equals performance, but he's got many more gems out there. So if you have an extra minute and you haven't looked up a bunch of stuff with Bill Walton, go do it, especially if you're feeling some of the negativity. He'll make you feel great again. As I said, Cat is out of the bag. We know how the league runs. That number 3 spot is going to be super coveted next year. So let's see how that breaks down. But like I also said, we have some more basketball left to be played. So the finals are still kicking off. I will check in afterwards with more of a league wrap up at that point. So if you're able to, don't know if you're back in Dallas or if you're back in Boston. Either way, we've got some young, talented players who are going to get their first NBA title, and that's exciting. So enjoy it, and we'll see you next time.